Today, I'm going to share three stories about people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a nice high-end teeth whitening kit, but don't tell them you've secretly replaced the whitener with red hair dye. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, 1967, a 17-year-old girl named Nancy McEwen was driving along a highway in Brooklyn, New York. She was on her way to her job as a secretary at her dad's office in Brooklyn, and she was coming from her home in Long Island, New York. Now, the commute to her office took about an hour, but Nancy didn't mind because her dad had just got her this beautiful, brand new yellow Camaro, and she loved driving it. And the highway she was on had this amazing view of the beach and ocean down below. And so that day, Nancy rolled down her window so she could feel the ocean breeze as she drove. Then she took in a deep breath and she smiled. At the same time Nancy was doing this, a police lieutenant was driving in his car a couple cars back from Nancy. And as he was just driving along, he suddenly sees this yellow Camaro that to this point had been driving completely normally suddenly veer off the road, miraculously missed the oncoming cars, and then smashed into a tree on the side of the road. And so the police lieutenant instinctively jammed on his brakes and veered over to the shoulder and stopped behind the Camaro. And as the lieutenant got out of the car, he was thinking clearly the driver must have just had some kind of medical emergency because he didn't see any obstacles in the road and, the Camaro had been driving completely normally to that point. So what would cause them to veer and crash into the road at such a high speed other than a medical emergency? And so the lieutenant jumps out of the car, runs over to the driver's side window, and he looks inside and he sees this teenage girl, this blonde teenage girl, and she's slumped over the wheel. And she's not looking up at him, she's not making any sound, she's just sitting there. And so he opens up the door and he asks her, are you okay? And she didn't say anything, but she did moan. And so she was breathing, she was alive, and there weren't any obvious physical injuries. Clearly she's just crashed into this tree at high speed, so she's definitely shaken up, but there weren't any obvious grievous injuries that have occurred here, at least none that he could see. And so he asked her again, hey, are you okay? What's going on here? And she just continued to moan. And so again, considering he's looking at her and she seems, basically okay, all things considered, he thought, maybe she's drunk. That would kind of explain, the sudden veering off the road. And so at this point, the lieutenant radioed for backup and also called for an ambulance. And while he waited, he began searching the car, just basically looking to see if maybe there was some clue in the car as to what happened here. For example, containers of alcohol. And so he's looking around and he doesn't see any empty bottles and he can't smell any alcohol in the car. But still, this whole time, the girl is not responding. She's just moaning and just kind of slumped over there. And then a couple of minutes later, he hears sirens and he looks up and a bunch of first responders came over. They pulled the girl out of the car, got her in the ambulance, and off to the hospital she went. Once Nancy got to the hospital, medical staff was able to determine that she was not drunk. But she did clearly appear to be having some kind of medical emergency. But they didn't know what it was. And again, there was no visible injuries on her. She just basically looked really shaken up and was non-responsive. And quickly, after Nancy was at the hospital, her condition only got worse, to the point where doctors were giving her shots of adrenaline to try to keep her alive. But it didn't work. And at 11:30 a.m., roughly 2.5 hours after Nancy crashed into the tree, she died. And it was only then, after Nancy was dead, that the medical staff made a discovery, something they had totally missed when Nancy had first came in. And that was, on the back of her head, hidden amongst her hair, was a small circular hole. It was a bullet wound, and for some reason, it didn't bleed at all. Clearly, Nancy did not just randomly veer off the road and smash into a tree. No, she had been shot. About 30 minutes after this discovery was made, a detective named Albert Seidman was standing next to Nancy's crashed car on the side of the highway. Seidman had a reputation as being this totally no-nonsense detective who effectively would stop at nothing to try to solve a case. By this point, he'd already spoken to Nancy's parents, who obviously were devastated and very confused by their daughter's death. They said that, Nancy never got in trouble and certainly didn't have any enemies, and so it made no sense that somebody had just shot her as she was driving. And Detective Seidman had to agree. This was not an average murder case. But regardless, he knew the best place to start this investigation was Nancy's car. The car was actually in pretty good shape. Despite striking this tree at high speeds, the body of the car basically remained intact. And so Seidman began going inside the car and looking all around it, looking for bullet holes to see where this bullet came in and struck the driver. But he found none. Really, there was nothing in the car that gave any information away about what actually happened here. Also, adding to the mystery here is Seidman knew there had been that police lieutenant who just happened to be driving a few cars back from Nancy when she suddenly veered off the road and crashed. And he would say that he did not hear any gunshots, although admittedly he wasn't really listening for gunshots, but he said everything was normal and then the car just veered and crashed. He couldn't understand it. Detective Seidman had briefly considered that, maybe Nancy had been shot by somebody inside of her car. But because of the presence of that lieutenant who immediately was on the scene and was basically looking at the car from the time it crashed all the way until the ambulance arrived, he said there was nobody else in the car and I did not witness anybody fleeing the scene. The whole situation was very bizarre. But Detective Seidman, thinking logically, thought, okay, well, we know she's been shot. So even though nobody knows how that happened, well, there has to be a shell casing somewhere for the round that struck her. And so for the rest of the day, Seidman and his team canvassed that whole highway all around that area looking for a shell casing, or really any clue that a gun had been fired in the vicinity. But they found nothing. By the end of the day, Detective Seidman was beginning to feel pretty disappointed about how the investigation was going so far. But he thought to himself, okay, well, I know I haven't found anything promising yet, but remember, she was shot not in some secluded area. She was shot on a major highway in Brooklyn, New York, a city of over 2.5 million people. Someone somewhere must have seen or heard something. And so instead of continuing to look for a shell casing, Seidman abandoned that idea and decided to go find witnesses. Over the next 5 days, Detective Seidman and his team scoured Brooklyn and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, looking for anybody who had any information about this shooting. They also put out a public plea for information and were fielding tips that way. But at the end of those 5 days, despite the huge number of interviews, they really hadn't gotten anywhere. As Seidman began to feel his frustration rising, because once again, it just felt like they were hitting another dead end on this case, he told himself, they must have missed something. They've talked to a ton of people, but maybe they were too quick. Maybe they weren't asking the right questions. And so on July 12th, he gathered up his team and he circled some spots on a map of Brooklyn and said, look guys, we're gonna go back to these key areas that are sort of positioned in the best angles to have maybe heard or seen something with this shooting, and we're gonna ask some more questions and just see if maybe these people have something we didn't catch. In one of those circled areas, the police discovered a gas station that was owned by a guy named Theodore DeLisi, and it was located only 2 blocks away from where Nancy had been shot. And on the morning of July 12th, when the police officers rolled up to this gas station, Theodore was working, he saw the police coming towards him, and right away he knew this had to be about Nancy McEwen. So Theodore had been following this case really closely as it was developing for 2 reasons. One, Nancy had been shot really close to his gas station, so there's that proximity bias. And 2, Theodore was actually friends with Nancy's father and had known Nancy growing up. And so this case really hit close to home. When the police walked inside the gas station, Theodore immediately asked them, "Are you here about Nancy?" And they would say yes. And that's when he would tell them his connection to Nancy and how he was following this case really closely. But despite his proximity to where she had been shot, he said unfortunately he hadn't seen or heard anything. But then Theodore quickly followed that up and said that, well, while he had been at the gas station in the morning for a little bit, he did take off at some point to go fishing out on the water in his boat, which was not too far away. But even from there too, he still said he didn't hear or see anything. But it was kind of noisy out on the water anyways, so, he really wouldn't have heard anything out there anyhow. The police nodded and asked some simple follow-up questions to Theodore about, take us through what happened that morning, what'd you see, were there other fishermen out there, when you were at the gas station, did you see anything unusual, just kind of seeing if there was anything that would jog his memory. And Theodore was answering every question as truthfully as he could, and at some point, he began to think really hard about what he actually saw when he was out on the water fishing, and suddenly, it all clicked. Theodore knew who killed Nancy. It would turn out at 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, the exact moment Nancy was shot, veered off the road and crashed, Theodore was in fact out in his boat fishing. Except at 8:40 a.m., he wasn't actually fishing. Instead, he had a can, and he threw that can into the water. And once he saw the can, he kind of kept staring at it, and then he raised his rifle and he fired a shot at the can. But he missed, and the bullet, by some fluke of physics, ricocheted off the surface of the water, went up into the highway right as Nancy had rolled her window down, struck her in the head, and killed her. Theodore knew he had been shooting his gun out on the water, but what he saw was the bullet hit the water. He didn't think for a second he could have fired up towards the highway. It was when police began asking questions that he thought, oh my goodness, it is possible. A ricochet could have struck her in the head. Theodore was charged with homicide, but ultimately a grand jury chose not to indict him, citing that this truly was an accident. Theodore did not serve any jail time, but he was fined $100 for firing a rifle within city limits. Hey guys! Did you know you can get your strange, dark, and mysterious fix anytime, anywhere with the Mr. Ballin podcast on Amazon Music? Well, you can. There are tons of stories waiting to be binged right now, plus there are exclusive stories on there that have never been shared on this YouTube channel. Amazon Music listeners get to listen to new episodes an entire month before everybody else. You can also listen to my other show, Mr.